and I'll try to cover ground that Janet hasn't already covered. Thank you all for being here. John, think about it. It is a Saturday morning in August, and we got a full house in here. That's a credit to you and your book, but thank you all for coming. I was going to be here regardless of who else came. I love being atop the mountain, and Janet, you ordered it just perfect. I got out of my car this morning, and the temperature on my car said 72 degrees, and I have always considered 72 the perfect temperature, and I'll tell you why. When I was a kid, I remember reading that's what they kept the Astrodome, and I thought, well, you know, if the Astrodome's 72, that's got to be the perfect temperature. So it was the perfect temperature when I got out of the car. One thing, and John and I have already done a podcast together, so we had kind of a dry run for this interview. But before we go back to Governor Rockefeller, I want to ask you just a little bit about yourself. You obviously got a good, proper British education. How on earth did you end up among us here in Arkansas? And how did your specialty become the civil rights era in Arkansas? A quick walkthrough about how that all happened.
Right, yeah. I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Nottingham in American Studies. And in my final year, I wrote my senior thesis on William Faulkner and race relations. I was kind of more into the literature side then, and got interested in the South and race through that, and knew I wanted to go on to further study and do my PhD. And the University of Newcastle upon Tyne in the northeast of England had a scholarship for a PhD, and I had one of the top civil rights scholars in the country working there too. And so I went to see him and kind of met with him, and we discussed a variety of different topics. And he had brought in the Arkansas Gazette on microfilm to do work on a project on white Southern governors and race just after the Second World War. And one of the people he was working on was Sid McMath, who was, of course, an early kind of forerunner of racial change in the state. And we discussed a variety of topics, and of course, the Central High crisis loomed large when you talk about Arkansas. But one of the things that hadn't been done with the school crisis at the time is to put the school crisis in a much larger perspective. There were a lot of books being written at the time on the so-called long civil rights movement. And so I decided to write on the long civil rights movement and look at the decades before the Little Rock school crisis in Arkansas and the decades afterwards, and put that event in a much larger context, and spent a year in Newcastle looking at microfilm copies of the Arkansas Gazette and the Arkansas State Press, which was a newspaper owned by Elsie and Daisy Bates, who were, of course, at the forefront of black community activism during the school crisis. And so I spent the entire first year going through the entire run of the Arkansas State Press on microfilm from 1941 to 1959. I think I may be the only person who's read every copy of the Arkansas State Press, or certainly I'm the only English person who's ever read every copy of the Arkansas State Press. And so I used that as a platform and spent a year living in Little Rock between the summer of '92 and the summer of '93, just when Bill Clinton was running for the first time for office. So it was a really exciting and interesting time to be around to do all that, and interviewed a lot of people, went to lots of different archives all around the United States and in Arkansas to do the research for that. And came back, wrote it up, got my first job. Then kind of in 1997, spent another 6 months in Fayetteville doing research to turn the thesis into a book, which is where I met my wife Charlene when I was over. So I'm married to an Arkansan who's from Gentry, Arkansas, and then was a professor at University of Wales, then moved to the University of London, and then in 2010 saw the job advertised for chair of department here at the UALR, and applied for the position and got the job, and I've been here for the last 12 years now. And so kind of got interested in Winthrop Rockefeller through my research on the civil rights movement, and that kind of race relations segue that we were talking about in the last session sort of kind of works seamlessly to kind of go from civil rights stuff to working on Winthrop Rockefeller, which I see as kind of an extension of the work I've done on the civil rights movement. You know, historians have talked about the long civil rights movement, and now they talk more about the wide civil rights movement and the kind of larger context of political and social and economic change that drove the civil rights movement. I think Winthrop Rockefeller is an important part of that story in Arkansas, as we heard this morning.
Well, you are an example, just like Governor Rockefeller's example is our greatest Arkansans sometimes come from elsewhere, but they end up staying here. So we're fortunate to have you, John. I'm sitting here thinking, though, the native Arkansans will get this. It would have taken me more than a year to get through those old gazettes on microfilm because I'd have been reading all the old Orville Henry columns, and I would have gotten sidetracked in my research reading all of Orville's old column. But going back, you cover, there's been quite a bit written about the Arkansas years here in Arkansas, but you are taking us back from birth until the arrival in Arkansas. And I sense that we have, as Arkansans, he's trying to get away from this failed marriage. He's trying to get away from the paparazzi. He's kind of the black sheep of his generation. We really have simplified those early Rockefeller years too much, haven't we? He was a complex man even as a young man.
He was, yeah. And I think one of the things that the book tries to do is to look at those continuities which went through Winthrop Rockefeller's life. There are 3 books that have been written about Winthrop Rockefeller's time in Arkansas, but I noticed that all of them very lightly covered his life coming up to his move to the state, which is the first 2/3 of his life. And I thought, well, that is probably quite important to know something about what he did for the first 2/3 of his life that will tell us a lot about his Arkansas years. In many ways, I think today we've viewed Winthrop Rockefeller's life backwards. That is, we started with the governorship, which came right at the end of his life, and kind of looked backwards towards that and what he did wider in Arkansas, and then kind of lost sight of what he did in New York over the horizon and in the distance. And I think this book kind of turns the story on its head and starts at the beginning and provides the context for what happened in Arkansas. And I think it's a crucial and important context because so many of the things that he did in Arkansas are tied to his early life, and so many of those themes run throughout his life. And I think this book helps to make sense of the stories that we already know about what he did in Arkansas and throw a light on those and help us to kind of contextualize them in a much more effective kind of way. I mean, that was really the purpose of kind of writing this particular volume of the book.
And you touched on this in your interview with Janet, but I think all of us in our own families can find examples of this, and that is a lot of times where we confuse intelligence with the ability to do well in a classroom and do well on tests. Winthrop Rockefeller strikes me as a very intelligent man from the start, just in a different way than his brothers were.
Yeah, and I suppose, we talk about kind of IQ and EQ, the kind of intellectual intelligence and emotional intelligence. And I think Rockefeller had, a great deal of empathy and a great deal of kind of emotional intelligence and could read people, could interact with people. You see that from his early days in school and his popularity with his schoolmates, the popularity again in the oil fields amongst, the kind of men there, the popularity he had in the military with his soldiers and, and the rest of the people he knew there. And that kind of carries on through, I think, to, all the stories you hear about his life in Arkansas and in Morrilton and the kind of direct ways that he influenced people and had this direct impact on them. The stories are replete with that. I'm amazed in Arkansas all the time when, I mention over the last 12 years that I've been here, I mention I'm doing work on Winthrop Rockefeller. And it's extraordinary how many people say, I have a story about Winthrop Rockefeller. And the story is often about a very personal connection, a very personal way that the governor sort of intervened or affected the lives of individual people. Now, I heard several stories like that just last night at the reception. I've heard many of them across the years, and it's fascinating to see how that really stretches back to his very earliest years and how he made these individual connections with people and how his ability to kind of interact with people and kind of make friends and kind of have this wide range of people who he knew and who he could interact with. That was really his sort of thing as a Rockefeller, his ability to kind of reach a very wide range of people and be able to interact with them.
As we dig down into the second half of the book a little bit, you mentioned the war years. Talk about how his service during the war really shaped him and really allowed him to shine in some other ways.
Yeah. His wartime service, when Winthrop first ran for governor in 1964 against Orville Forbes, he kind of issued the Win Rockefeller story, which kind of explained his life to the voters. And he said that, his wartime service was his single greatest achievement of his life. He considered that in 64 when he first ran. And so his wartime service had a very profound impact on him. And, one of the things that the book did and one of the things that my research did was to discover this treasure trove of oral history that he'd done that got turned into a book called Letter to My Son, to Win Paul, that had kind of emerged out of these oral history transcripts, and which has often been the kind of main source for understanding Winthrop's early life. But through a range of incidents, this book ended up ending just at the beginning of the Second World War and omitting the kind of things that he'd really wanted to highlight. So one of the things I was able to do is to go back to the original sources for A Letter to My Son and find out that it was a much longer project than the eventual published document ended up being. And there's this whole series of stories that he'd written about his life during World War II, which profoundly affected him and profoundly shaped him. He crisscrossed the United States, rising through the ranks of the military, but in particular, the 18 months he spent overseas, going from Hawaii to Guam to Leyte to Okinawa, working his way across the Pacific, kind of profoundly shaped him. Not only did he spend a lot of time away from the family and again grow more of his own independence. I think you see that a lot when he returns from the war, that he's much more independent from the rest of the family, and he's kind of learned to live without the family and learned to stand on his own feet. But also just how grueling the experience was as well. I think the book conveys that, how he was like sleeping in foxholes with 6 inches of water in them on a regular basis, and he survived a kamikaze attack on his transport ship barely, and got hepatitis twice while he was overseas, and got all these illnesses and lost all this weight, and was treated for burns in Guam. So he didn't have the lap of luxury. He didn't have a kind of Rockefeller experience in the military at all. He was living the life of a day-to-day, combat infantryman without any airs and graces, and kind of learned to live life roughing it over in the Pacific, which he already had a chance to do in the oil fields, but this was that to the nth degree again. So those kinds of experiences again were something that none of the rest of his family, none of the rest of the brothers experienced. He was the only person who went out in the infantry and fought on the front lines, and made a point of doing that. When the war started, he was the only brother who was not yet married and who didn't have any children. So he said, the Rockefeller family benefits probably more than any other family in the United States from the freedom and democracy that we have, and therefore we have a duty to go and defend that democracy as a family, and I'm going to be the person who's going to represent us on the front lines doing that. And of course his brothers were happy to allow him to do that, and they got most of them got office jobs, and David did go overseas and worked in intelligence, but Winthrop was the one who shouldered most of the burden for the family, for representing the family in the Second World War on the front lines, and gained a lot of kudos and plaudits in the family because he played that role.
Now, you mentioned before the break, you mentioned Frank Newell, that of course being the Arkansas connection. What, from your studies, what drew a member of what at the time was the nation's richest family to a guy from one of its poorest states, Frank Newell, and what drew Frank Newell to Winthrop Rockefeller? Did you get any sense of that in your study of those war years?
Yeah, I think, Frank was quite an intelligent guy. Coming from Arkansas, I think he was surprised that he knew Russian literature and was well versed in Russian literature, and he'd done a degree at the University of Arkansas in literature, and was quite sophisticated. And I think that attracted Winthrop to him. That he knew a lot of things, he knew a lot about literature, and he was somebody who Winthrop could have conversations with on the same kind of intellectual level when he was in the military. And he met him first at Fort Benning when he was a machine gun instructor there. Winthrop was a machine gun instructor. But then they kind of soldered a friendship when they moved to South Carolina, and Omri was there, and he was attached to his unit for a while, and then they split during when they were overseas, but they remained in touch. And I think he looked up to Frank as an older brother a lot of the time. His other friend in the army was Graham Hawkes, who was kind of a kind of younger brother to him, and who Winthrop took under his wing. But Frank was kind of somebody like an older brother who he looked up to a lot of the time, and whose company he liked, and was a great conversationalist, much like Winthrop himself. So he was somebody who was good company, and who he lent a lot on during the war to kind of have those conversations, and they forged this bond in combat and in service together.
Rockefeller shows up 1953 at the Sam Peck Hotel in downtown Little Rock, moves into the penthouse. Do you think in his mind at the time that he was looking at that probably as maybe a short sojourn, like the years in the oil fields, 2 or 3 years, and then back to New York? I mean, he couldn't have had any idea, I wouldn't think, in 1953 he would spend the rest of his life in Arkansas.
Right, yeah, that's an interesting question. When Winthrop kind of decided to make the commitment to Arkansas, and certainly the family didn't see it that way. The family certainly thought of it as, well, this is Winthrop, going away again and getting out of the way, but, he'll be back soon. And, if you look in the Rockefeller archives and the archival papers, which I've poured over, there are telegrams from his brother John that said, we look forward to seeing you back in New York soon, and his sister Babs, who said, we miss you at Christmas, but we know you'll be back soon, and all those kinds of things. So it was clear that the family didn't think it was going to be a permanent move, and maybe Winthrop didn't either. But when he discovered Petit Jean, and I think, when he started to put down roots here and build Windrock Farms and have that kind of investment, then people knew that he was going to stay and be serious about the place, which incidentally is why the dates of the book run to 1956. He came here in 1953, but I think, the decision to become an Arkansauer and kind of set roots in the state and kind of become part of the state was a transition. So I think by 56, it was pretty clear that Winthrop was intent on becoming an Arkansauer, that he'd invested in the state, that he'd already started to set up his philanthropic foundation, that he'd already started on Windrock Farms, and that it was clear by that point that he was here for the long run, and that he was going to stay, and that he wasn't just a temporary move, and he wasn't going to go back to New York, and this was he was set on this being his future.
Arkansas lost population. You may not realize this, but from 40 to 60, we lost a higher percentage of population than any other state in the Union. You know this, John, going from 7 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives to 4, and we're still at 4. There was so much population loss. So he's coming to a state that's really in trouble from an economic standpoint, from a social standpoint, losing population faster than ever. But he obviously fell in love with Arkansas. You talk about Petit Jean, it's easy to see, but it was more than the natural beauty. It was the people and wanting to help them. And it seems to me, you go up to just the move to Arkansas, but it seems to me during those early years that he really did fall in love with the state and its people, and had a real desire as that first chairman of Arkansas Industrial Development Commission to try to turn some of these things around. What caused him to fall in love with this place that obviously he knew nothing about, I have to think, other than what he'd heard from Frank Newell during the war before moving here?
Yeah, I think, the commitment sort of comes from his early experiences. He was probably one of the only brothers who could have moved to Arkansas and be comfortable here and be comfortable living here, because he'd had the experiences in the oil fields and mixing with Texans there, and kind of just regular folk on a day-to-day basis, and he had the experiences in the military, being able to be around just ordinary kind of American folk. And when he moved to Arkansas, it was a comfortable environment up here, because the people of Morrilton were kind of like the people who he met in the Texas oil fields, kind of like the people he'd been around in the military, and those were the kind of happiest times of his life, the great adventures that he'd had. So I think he felt quite comfortable here, being among the people in Arkansas and in Morrilton and around the state. And he found in Arkansas his kind of life project. I spoke in the first part of this about how Winthrop had struggled to find his place. What was his place? John was the philanthropist, Nelson was the politician, all those kinds of things. And kind of typically and interestingly, Winthrop fitted in by adopting an entire state. And that was his thing. Arkansas became his thing as a Rockefeller. And that's kind of quintessential Winthrop in a lot of ways, because it's one thing, but it's a bunch of things too. And he was always interested in a variety of different things, of kind of having his hand in doing lots of different things. And he was interested in all these different kinds of projects, and he didn't really want to commit to one rather than the other. And I think committing to Arkansas allowed him to have a focal point for what he wanted to do, but within that larger umbrella, have his hand trying to do lots of different things and incorporate all these different kinds of interests under one specific task of kind of trying to develop Arkansas and the state. And of course, in the 1960s, it was a crucial time when Arkansas's economy went from an agrarian base to an industrial economy, and Winthrop's role with the Arkansas Industrial Development Commission was kind of a key to transforming the state and bringing industrial development here and bringing his sizable fortune and contacts with the national kind of corporations to the state. And having a Rockefeller name touting for business for Arkansas had a powerful pull on the national level, and people recognized the name. If they didn't recognize Arkansas, they recognized Rockefeller, and so Rockefeller helped to bring new business and new industry into the state that another person without that kind of profile may not well have done.
A state like Arkansas, as you have certainly found out in your years here, we have no major professional sports teams. We don't have many movie stars live here. So I've always said it doesn't take much to become a celebrity in Arkansas. I mean, in my childhood, think about it. TV weathermen are celebrities in Arkansas, right? A big deal. Big deal in Arkansas. Those are our celebrities. So you have a Rockefeller move here, and suddenly he is a celebrity in this state. We talked about, and you did in the first interview, how good he was, whether it was in the oil fields during the war, one-on-one relating with people. But it strikes me that it was really painful, the public speaking, and this is even long before his first run for governor in '64, as chairman of AIDC, getting a lot of public speaking, kind of an inherently shy man. That was a lot of that was pretty painful for him, was it not, to go out and give those public speeches?
Yeah, to some degree, I think. He was much more of an informal kind of person than a formal person. I think he enjoyed casual, kind of informal environments to the formal environment, and he was more natural and at home in that arena than others. But he had. And one of the things that the book kind of underlines, he had quite a lot of experience, speaking experience. He worked with the Greater New York Fund in the late 1930s, and which was a kind of his first major foray into philanthropy, which was a kind of umbrella entity of charitable organizations in New York. And he, stumped the speech for them and made many speeches for them. And the National Urban League, after the end of the Second World War, when he was very involved with the National Urban League and became a kind of national face for the National Urban League, and went on many speaking tours for them, spoke at their annual conferences, spoke at the annual conventions, and was lauded in the black press for his role in kind of urging fair employment practices in industry and in the Rockefeller entities too. So, he did have some experience with that and to draw on. I think it was quite different coming to Arkansas, and I think it was difficult for him to kind of make that transition from, doing these things on a national level in New York to kind of connecting with people in Arkansas politics in that more formal way. So he could do that, but I think in Arkansas it made it more difficult, and I think his natural inclination was to a kind of more informal and casual contacts with people rather than kind of, this kind of formal position of being governor, which didn't really sit that very easily with him. That was the kind of thing that his brothers did, not necessarily the kind of thing that he did. And so I think being governor and taking on that role kind of made him more self-conscious than he otherwise would have been.
And he also strikes me as a man who always said, I can really express myself better through doing than by speaking it. I actually do it. And I know I'm taking us past the end of your book just a little bit, but we're sitting here at the Winthrop Rockefeller Ranch, and it seems to me, obviously, he took great pride in developing this state. I mean, we were a cotton-based economy, and here we were top of a rocky mountain that really only grew rocks and cedar trees, so not much success growing cotton up here. It was land that a lot of people thought were worthless, and it seems to me he was not only doing it for a sense of his own pride, but to show Arkansans you can build world-class things in this state. And I'm going to run irrigation up the side of this mountain, and I'm going to build a world-class ranch. Was that not a message to the other people of Arkansas in a way?
Absolutely. And, you know, he had this sort of can-do attitude, which is kind of personified with this idea that, they all told him to build the farm at the bottom of the mountain where the water was, because, that made sense, but the view was nicer at the top, and, it's cooler at the top of the mountain. So he had spent all this money to pump the water up to the top of the mountain and clear all the top of the mountain off and kind of do all this stuff and kind of build this city on a hill, which became Winthrop Farms, with its own fire department and its own airstrip and all those kinds of things. So, he went to a great deal of expense to carve out the kind of place that he wanted it to be. But I think that was typical of the way that Winthrop approached Arkansas and approached philanthropy and approached politics too, that he was very much a person who pursued case studies. He wanted to build a working model of excellence to be able to show it off to the rest of the world. So Winthrop Farms was an example of that, and he wanted to build, a cattle ranch or cattle farm. He didn't like the term ranch. He built a cattle farm that would be a model farm, and of course, it was incredible at the time when it was built. People came from all over Arkansas to look at Winthrop Farms up here, and it was kind of one of the major tourist attractions in the state for many years. Thousands of people would come up and look at what was going on here, and it was like nothing they'd ever seen before. But Winthrop kind of continued that kind of case study approach to philanthropy, and helped to construct a model school in Morrilton. And he thought that would be a model school which people would look up to as a model rural school district that could be replicated in other places. He helped to build the Perry County rural clinic, and it was a kind of model and a case study in how you might approach rural medicine and make rural medicine, take that to different areas as well across the state. So the kind of leading by example and creating these case studies and creating these models of excellence as a working example of what could be achieved was very much central, I think, to the way that Winthrop approached philanthropy and the way that he could have an impact in the state.
I will let you know, by the way, John, I've got a native Texan wife, so I like to gig her when I can, and I always tell her, I've been to the Rockefeller Ranch, I've been to the LBJ Ranch, this one's better. So, take that, Texas. Go ahead.
Well, that was a solid transition. Did we mute him? Again, we did want to encourage some questions from the crowd.